So thank you very much for joining me. This is the virtual book launch of Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking. This is my new book coming out in paperback today in the United Kingdom and other parts of the world. I'm actually capable of seeing what people are saying on this live chat, which is interesting. What I might do is set out the basic arguments of Rebel Ideas for 10 or 15 minutes, depending on whether the live chat is telling me I'm going on too long. And then I'll take some of the questions that you are posting. So we often think about diversity in demographic terms, differences in race and gender and social class, religious background, and so on. I'm going to focus my observations on cognitive diversity, diversity of thought, differences in insights and perspectives and information, and the different models and heuristics that we deploy to make sense of the world around us. I think it's probably fair to say there is an overlap between these two conceptions. After all, our identities influence our experiences and the way we filter and make sense of the world around us. But I want to suggest that the overlap is not so significant in other contexts, and that we mustn't reduce diversity to a box-ticking exercise. I think it could be a lot more powerful than that. By the way, towards the end of my time, I'll talk a little bit about the current crisis and how I think diversity can help in the difficulties we're currently confronting. Let me perhaps start with a conceptual example to highlight why cognitive diversity matters. So imagine you're putting together a team of 10 people to come up with great ideas for the next 5 years of your school strategy or your company strategy or whatever institution you're involved with. And let's say also that each of these individuals are quite creative and each of them comes up with 10 genuinely brilliant ideas. So you have 10 people, each one of whom has come up with 10 genuinely brilliant ideas. How many genuinely brilliant ideas do you have in total? Now, if I was answering that question, I would automatically say 100, 10 times 10. But if these people think in the same way and they come up with the same ideas as one another, you might only have 10. If, on the other hand, they're cognitively diverse and come up with different ideas from one another, then you could have 100. Now, this, I think, is a obvious, but also in a funny kind of way, a subtle point. These are two teams comprised of individuals of equal talent, of equal individual creative idea generation, and yet one of the two teams is almost 1,000% more creative. If your HR department is hiring on individual ability, they'll find it impossible to understand this contrast because each of these individuals is equally talented. It's only by taking a step back and looking at the teams holistically and looking not just at their individual creativity, but their meaningful differences that you can understand why one of them is going to be far more innovative. Now, one of the reasons I got to thinking about this topic was partly to do with the fact that I'm in a group that advises Gareth Southgate, the England men's football coach, and Philip Neville, the English women's football coach, on issues of performance. But it's quite an interesting group because on it is Dave Brailsford, who is a cycling coach, and Manoj Badali, who is a high-tech startup guy, Stuart Lancaster is a rugby coach, Lucy Giles, the head of the Sandhurst Military Training Academy, Sue Cameron, an Olympic sport expert. So it's a cognitively diverse group. And it's easy to criticize a group like that. In fact, a couple of football journalists said this is ridiculous. Harry Redknapp knows more about football than Manoj Badali. Tony Pulis, another football manager, by the way, has forgotten more about football than Lucy Giles will ever know. And that is true. But there's a problem if you have a group of people who think in the same way, because Gareth Southgate and Philip Neville already know what Redknapp and Pulis know. They were socialized into the basic assumptions of English football, a way of playing, a way of setting up tactically, a way of recovering. And so what you get in that context is a mirroring dynamic. People are agreeing all the time, becoming more and more confident about assumptions that might be gravely flawed or at least incomplete. What's interesting about this group is when somebody says something not known to anyone else. So Dave Brailsford might talk about how big data sets in cycling are enabling the personalization of diet, or Lucy Giles about how they prepare the SAS for combat. The psychology of it, the pressure of it. Suddenly you're getting the cross-pollination of ideas, you're getting divergent thinking, and by implication, a big uplift in the collective intelligence of the group. Now, one of the stories that I relate in Rebel Ideas is one of a time of great crisis in the world, the Second World War. Because one of the teams that turned out to be of great significance was the team that cracked the Enigma, the team at Bletchley Park, which many of you will be familiar with. And of course, if you're trying to hire a group of code breakers, if you're anything like me, then you're thinking great mathematicians and number crunchers. And they did hire, by the way, great mathematicians and number crunchers, including, of course, one of the most pioneering mathematicians of the 20th century, Alan Turing. But on January the 12th, 1942, the Daily Telegraph newspaper organized a crossword competition. A reader had written to the editor saying the crosswords are getting too easy, I can solve them in less than 10 minutes. And the editor was slightly skeptical about this. And he thought that it wasn't possible to solve the crossword in less than 10 minutes under controlled conditions. But he said, if anyone thinks that they can, do come to the newsroom floor on Fleet Street. And if you do so, I will make a £100 donation to charity, which was quite a lot of money back then. And actually, we have somebody here, Shana Tufile, on the chat, who's from the Alan Turing Institute. So a lovely connection. Now, 30 people turned up at the invitation of the editor of the Daily Telegraph to do the crossword, one of whom was Stanley Sedgwick. Now, he was a lowly bank clerk, worked in the city, and learned to play the Daily Telegraph crossword on the daily commute in from the suburbs. And he performed brilliantly on the day, just over 10 minutes, but brilliantly nonetheless. But what Sedgwick didn't know, and what the editor of the Daily Telegraph didn't know, and what none of the other contestants knew, is that one of the observers on that day was from the British Secret Intelligence Services. And a week later, Sedgwick got a letter in the post saying, we need to see you on a matter of supreme national urgency. He was quite surprised, by the way, when he got this letter, because what Bletchley Park had quintessentially is the understanding of the power of cognitive diversity. They were early adopters of cognitive diversity. They knew that a team of Alan Turings would have been a team of brilliant individuals that would have been hopelessly incapable of solving this multifaceted, interconnected problem. And Sedgwick, it turns out, brought something of crucial significance from a different part of what I call the problem space. Because it turns out that crossword enthusiasts and code breakers have something in common. And that is that they're very good quasi-mind readers. You may not know that the national newspapers each have 4 or 5 crossword setters, and very good crossword solvers are able to identify the crossword setter in the first 1 or 2 clues and efficiently anticipate what is coming and therefore solve them in double quick time. And it turns out this is important for cracking the Enigma, because the Enigma operators are supposed to put the letters in randomly. But under pressure of time in a war situation, they were sometimes repeating their inputs, using the first 3 letters of a girlfriend or boyfriend's name, perhaps, or the first 3 letters of a swear word. Sedgwick was brilliant at getting into the mind of the Enigma operator, and he worked in Hut 10, which was intercepting the weather Enigma, very important for Bomber Command, but these also operated as cribs for the naval Enigma. And this turned out to be of massive significance because the naval Enigma had 2 independent layers of encryption, and cracking it enabled the Allies to win the Battle of the Atlantic, get the supplies over. So finding those voices that give you a different but nevertheless relevant part of a complex puzzle is how teams are able to innovate, solve problems, and come up with creative solutions. But of course, there's a great underlying psychological tragedy here, which is that we are unconsciously attracted to people who think just like us. It makes us feel smarter when people are telling us things we already know. It validates our assumptions and our worldview. The pleasure centers of our brains light up in a brain scanner when people are telling us things that we already know. So there is an unconscious tendency for human groups to congregate together who are individually intelligent, but collectively stupid. They share the same basic blind spot, which makes them incapable of seeing the bigger picture that is important for these really difficult challenges that we face. And to turn briefly to the coronavirus pandemic, one of the interesting things for me was the way that, for example, Formula One came together with UCL, University College London, and UCL Hospital to create a breathing machine in what I think was just 100 hours. Now, I talked to Mercedes and some other people involved in this very important project, and the first thing that they talked about was cognitive diversity. Because even a relatively simple breathing machine has lots of intricate parts, concepts that need to be solved in order for the thing to get done. You've got precision engineering, reverse engineering, manufacturing, circuitry, and a whole range of other things. And these people came together. They brought slightly different lenses to the problem, but the holistic effect was a problem that was solved in double quick time. And that brings me to one other thing that might come out of this crisis, which is the role of meetings in our society, in our cultures, in our organizations. How often do these slow us down? How often are they vehicles for procrastination? And there's a long body of research, which I refer to in Rebel Ideas, that meetings predict bad outcomes even more powerfully than smoking predicts cancer. And I think a lot of people can relate to this. And one of the reasons is even when you do have the diverse voices in a room, that diversity isn't communicated because of the stifling effects of hierarchy. Now, let me just unpack that a little bit. What can often happen when there is a dominant boss in a room, and many bosses are quite domineering, that's one of the reasons they rise to the top, not all, by the way, but some, is that people are fearful of expressing a different view, even though one that is relevant, because they're worried that the boss will interpret that as rebellious or some form of sedition. And so people unconsciously begin to share not what they truly think, but what they think the leader wants to hear. And that means that you basically get this shrinking in the collective intelligence where everyone is parroting the boss. And it means that you're not getting the contributions that should be coming from these diverse minds. And why would you want to have a meeting anyway, if not to extract the brilliant ideas from the minds in the room? So some of the suggestions that I have in the book about making meetings more effective, one of them from Amazon, they start each meeting with a agenda item, not PowerPoint, but written in narrative form. So you get adjectives and nouns and verbs and adverbs. You get a more granular understanding of what is being proposed. Then they spend 15 minutes reading this agenda item in silence. So they're now all bringing their independent perspectives to bear. Is this a good idea? Where are the potential pitfalls? How can it be improved? What can I bring for my own understanding to how this can be implemented effectively? What are the risks associated with it, or how it can be improved? Once they've all brought their independent perspectives to mind, they then speak in a way effectively in reverse order of seniority. The leader speaks last. That doesn't mean the leader isn't still the person making a decision. You still need to have decision makers, but that decision is much better, much more effective when you get the chance to hear what people truly think. Now, having spoken for the classic amount of time for a TED Talk, I'm just going to have a quick glance at the questions coming in. I know we've got some really interesting people. We've got chief executives, we've got head teachers, we've got teachers, we've got high-tech people. Now, so a question here about education. And at the University of Cambridge, we're encouraging teachers to think across subject silos. And that's from Paul Ellis at Cambridge University. Now, this, I think, is of fundamental importance in understanding how science is changing and has changed over the course of the last 100 years. Most of the hit papers in science 50 years ago were written by individual authors who were expert in a single sphere or silo or subject of expertise. They were effectively drilling deeper into a particular sliver of knowledge. Very, very important, and it's great that they did so. But there has been a fundamental change in the nature of science in recent years, which is that most of the hit papers today are characterized by what researchers describe as atypical subject combinations. That's to say, they're bringing diverse thinkers together in collaborative interdisciplinary teams. So you might have somebody who's an expert in economics and another who's an expert in psychology, or somebody who's very good at history and others who are anthropologists and ethnographers. And what you're getting there again is a cross-pollination of ideas. To put it in slightly technical terms, you can, but actually, before I get to the technical point, you see the same pattern in the patent catalog. So practical innovation. 50 years ago, patents were characterized by a single code. Now they're characterized by multiple codes. And the reason is that if you think of biological evolution, natural selection can be thought of as the trial and error learning, rapid prototyping, beta testing, things of that kind. You're effectively changing incrementally the product or the offering through time. Sexual recombination is a bit like the cross-pollination of ideas, and it's sexual reproduction that massively increased the speed of the complexity that emerged from biological evolution. Sorry if that was a bit contrived as a metaphor, but to go back to the point that Paul is making, what the great scientists of today are capable of doing is not merely having deep subject knowledge, but also knowing how to meaningfully collaborate with other scientists in order to solve problems and to come up with new ideas and theories and hypotheses for testing. So I think, Paul, you're onto something very important there, and the capacity to jump out of silos and act as bridges between silos, very important also in the corporate world, and I think in all other contexts that are confronting difficult, complex problems. Getting some interesting feedback on meetings. I mean, I ought to say perhaps that one of the issues with some professional services firms, and I know that there's quite a few tuning in today, is that sometimes you can have a leadership team or any other team that looks diverse. They look diverse, but they've been at the organization so long that they think in very similar ways, identikit patterns of thought. They reach for the same metaphors to reason through problems. They use the same historical precedents. And that's a problem, because it means that there may be big disruptions coming along, opportunities to take advantage of, but none of the people in the room are seeing those because they all think in a very similar way and are looking out into the world through one very small window. So looking at some other questions here. So one on making good forecasts. So this obviously relevant today with epidemiology and the scientific forecasts that are being used to drive government policy around the world. I think one of the most interesting experiments in the art of good forecasting was conducted by Jack Soll at Duke University. And he took economic forecasters who have a bad reputation, but nevertheless, some are reasonably skilled. And he looked at the distribution of forecasting accuracy. And as you would expect, the distribution was a bell-shaped distribution of the kind that characterizes a great deal of human groups. And the most accurate forecaster was about 5% more accurate than an average forecaster. So not terribly surprising. But then he took the top 6 forecasters, put them in what you might call a nominal team, and took the average of their forecasts. He's now trying to find their collective judgment. Now, in a simple activity like sprinting, running in a straight line, if you take the time of the fastest runner and compare that time with the average time of the top 6 runners in the Olympic final, what is faster? The time of the fastest runner or the average time of the top 6 runners? Well, it has to be the time of the fastest runner, unless it's a dead heat involving all 6 or all 8. But when Soll took the average of the top 6 forecasters and compared it with the accuracy of the top forecaster, the average of the top 6 was more accurate, not 1% or 5% more accurate, not 10% more accurate, but 15% more accurate. This is a staggeringly large effect, not known to the economic forecasters themselves, which is interesting, right? Because let's look at the reason why. First of all, each forecaster, implicitly or explicitly, normally explicitly, uses a model to make a forecast. Each of these models, if the economist is worth their salt, contains some useful information. But if you combine the information from 6 models, you must have more information than in any one model, even the best model. Now, of course, each of these models also contains biases and blind spots and errors. So what you want to do is pull the information and filter the errors. And the technique of averaging, for what it's worth, the errors tend to cancel out. Some people are a bit higher than the inflation turnout or the eventual oil price. Some are lower. This is called the wisdom of the crowds, and it's robust finding in prediction science. But what's interesting about it is 2 things. One, the increase in predictive accuracy is far higher than you would expect, but also it's the size of the crowd that you need in order to make the best forecast. Soll's paper is called The Wisdom of Small Crowds. And in my view, in most complex contexts, it's having a small crowd of accurate forecasters taking their collective judgment that gets you the best overall forecast. I've been thinking a lot about how that might apply to epidemiology. A lot of faith has been vested in the imperial college model, which was written 13 years ago, the code not yet released, by Neil Ferguson, Professor Ferguson. And it was modeling based on previous flu epidemics. And I do wonder, and I've done some work in this, but it's very difficult to drill deeper because all of the epidemiologists are so busy, understandably, at the moment, about finding different models of different kinds might give a more accurate overall assessment of what the trajectory of this epidemic might look like. Here's a question from Anthony Goss. Sir Alex Ferguson, did he apply the concepts behind cognitive diversity? Well, I think he did to an extent. He always brought in assistant managers who challenged him in quite significant ways, particularly on training. So that was all the way from, now I'm going to test myself, Archie Knox through Steve McLaren and Carlos Quiroz, Mike Phelan. He was I think, aware of how that would help him. And he was also very adaptive tactically. So there were 2 or 3 very significant changes in the way Man United set up, particularly in European competitions. And he was a great learner from other managers. So I think he used it to a point. Jurgen Klopp, obviously a master of using cognitive diversity. His support team is outstanding, big data, a throw-in coach. And he's quoted often saying that these people know not necessarily more than him about football, but they're bringing things that he himself doesn't know and couldn't know. And it's getting that cross-pollination that has helped him do well. And if I may use one other sports example from the book, and this is an example from British sport where obviously British athletes have been doing quite well at the Olympic Games, something I failed to do in my 2 Olympic attempts. I'm a former table tennis player, by the way. I played in the Olympics in Barcelona and Sydney. But in the build-up to 2012, the R&D people working in British sport realised they needed to get more cognitive diversity. So they found engineers in academia and industry to a meeting in Sheffield, where they suddenly got this extraordinary cross-pollination. So Formula One technology helped to build Winter Olympic bobsleighs. British aerospace technology built the skeleton sled on which Amy Williams won gold in Vancouver. Sensors for swimmers to perfect the tumble turn. Hot pants for cyclists to wear and keep their muscles warm. Liquid repellent that coated the spray skirt of Ed McKeever's canoe, and so on. So a pretty powerful thing. We're seeing a lot more of this in sport. And one of the interesting things, actually, is 10 years ago when Clive Woodward went into football, they were saying, what could he possibly know about football? He's a rugby coach. That's the point. Having somebody from a rugby background working with football experts is going to help create a better understanding of the overall problem, which is, in that case, trying to win football matches. This is a very interesting question from Rupert Stubbs. Have you looked at mathematician Ole Peters' work on ergodicity in economics, which is challenging some of the fundamental assumptions of that subject? So he co-wrote a paper in 2011 with the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Murray Gell-Mann. And the short answer to that question is I am very interested in this. I think it is relevant to our understanding of epidemiology and the coronavirus. Ole, I have gone and visited many times at the London Maths Lab, which is just by Barons Court Tube, by the way, Rupert. And I've spent a lot of time with Alex Adamau, the collaborator. For those who are interested, ergodicity is about multiplicative dynamics. This is, I think, one of the big disruptions that is about not just to hit economics, but social science more generally. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Ole Peters, even though he can't get any of his papers published at the moment in economics journals, I think he will at some point in the future win the Nobel Prize for economics. I think ergodicity will help to explain much more detail what happened in the 2008 crunch. It will have a lot to say about economic growth, and also, of course, about tail risk and black swan events. Let me just scroll up. I'm conscious that I've scrolled all the way to the bottom. Paul, thank you. I'm in a very white room. This is true. I'm upstairs in what used to be my daughter's bedroom. Let's just take 1 or 2 more. If anyone's got any more questions, just do tweet me. I'd love to take some more of this. I'm conscious that I said I'd limit it to half an hour. Perhaps I'll give one other. I'm a reporter from the Daily Star Online. David Rivers, are you doing interviews for this book? Yes, of course, David. Email me, matthew.side@thetimes.co.uk, and thank you for engaging. Let me perhaps finish with one other example of a good way to think about, if you have a team and you're wondering, are we sufficiently diverse? Here's a great way to, you've probably heard of brainstorming as a way of coming up with creative ideas. The problem with brainstorming is, you can imagine, as soon as the leader in the group comes up with an idea, everyone starts unconsciously converging on that idea, and it suppresses genuine creative idea generation. A better technique is brainwriting. This is where people write down ideas and they post them on a notice board. So no one knows who suggested which idea. So you're kind of separating the quality of the idea from the status of the person who suggested it. So you're creating a meritocracy of ideas. So lab experimentation, brainwriting, much better than brainstorming, more ideas and higher quality of ideas as rated by independent assessors. Now, here's a great thing to do is get people in your team to brainwrite. Who are the voices we're not currently hearing from? Who might have the set of insights that differ from what we currently know, but might nevertheless be relevant for what we're seeking to do? In other words, how could we find the Stanley Sedgwick? My consultancy company has done this with some FTSE 100 companies with genuinely outstanding results. Because as I say, it's so easy to get into the comfort zone of just connecting with people who share my basic view. That's fine in a simple environment. Absolutely no problem. As soon as it's a complex environment or one that's rapidly changing, that can be a disaster. Thank you so much. And you're right. So, Kurt, Edward Linley, we need psychological safety for this. That's true. In other words, psychological safety, I sometimes worry about the term. It describes a culture where people feel they can say what they truly think, rather than what they think the leader wants to hear. But psychologically safe environment isn't a meek environment. It's a dynamical environment. People are saying what they think. They're being challenged. You're getting this friction in the room from which you get the imagination. So thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute joy to be with you. I hope it worked. I'm not sure if I cut out at any point. First time I've ever done anything like this. Do tweet me with any more questions. I will get to them later this evening. If you get a chance to look at the book, you can buy it on Amazon or Waterstones. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed.